Morning, everyone. You've probably seen me around from the beginning, but just to recap, I'm Jon Mathias. I help run the MPN Advocates Network and also the MPN Voice UK support group for MPNs. I'm sure Michelle will introduce herself when she has her slides in front of her. I'm actually quite grateful that we're in this particular slot, even though we happen to be the two people standing between you and A, your lunch, B, the city tour, and C, actually going home to your friends and families. The reason I'm grateful is that actually a lot of the ground that I wanted to cover with the slides I've got here has been covered to some extent very well by previous speakers. And I hope that maybe some of the things I want to put in front of you will serve as a sort of summary or a bringing together of some of that information. The topic that we wanted to address here is how patient advocates, patient advocacy groups can produce evidence, why they need to produce evidence for proving the case for fundamentally for reimbursement. Okay, so it's quite a focused topic. We've peripherally mentioned health technology assessments, HTAs, in a few of the presentations that we've heard over the past couple of days. I just wanted to make sure everybody's on the same page with that. So a health technology assessment is the whole process whereby a decision is made whether to make a new technology or a change technology available. By technology, we mean either a new type of treatment or, more specifically, a new drug. Trials, and we've heard a lot about trials over the past couple of days, prove that the therapy works and that it is safe. After that, HTAs try to decide whether it's worthwhile, okay, whether it's fundamentally worth the money. And they use quite complicated and quite controversial calculations, economic calculations, to determine value for money. Now, do patient organizations always have a role in that process? Well, it depends. Lots of HTA processes around the world do now include the patient voice in those in those decisions, but not always. And that's a key point for us to remember as a global organization. And what does that process look like? Well, again, that depends, and it can be pretty complicated, and I'm not going to stand here this morning to try and cover the minutiae of those processes in different countries. One thing I would say is that one of our responsibilities as patient advocates in particular countries and regions is to understand how that HTA process works in your country. Personally, I think it's one of the most valuable activities that we could be involved in as advocates is to involve ourselves in those processes and to some extent become experts in them. I don't profess to be an expert even in the HTA process in the UK, but it's my ambition to be so. That's what I want to be able to do more for the patients that I represent. Now, does it work? Does patient involvement in HTA processes work? I'm grateful here to, and this is not the first time I'm going to mention Leukemia Care. I'm very grateful to the larger organisation in the UK that's provided some of the information for this presentation and some analysis that they commissioned about the involvement of the patient and voice in HTAs. This is actually from the Scottish Medicines Consortium. Unbelievably, even in the UK, we have multiple HTA processes, but the one that works in Scotland shows the difference between the prior period when there was limited or little patient involvement and afterwards. And you can see from the graph that after the patient, what's it called, the patient and clinician engagement process, PACE, After that was initiated in 2014, we saw an increase in the number of acceptances of proposals for new medicines and corresponding decrease in the number that were rejected. So it's a crude measurement, and there are quite a few factors involved in this picture you're seeing here. But even if the evidence is limited, we passionately believe that patient involvement does produce better outcomes for patients. Now, just a bit of terminology, quality of life. So this graph, and I'm proud to say that my graph is a hell of a lot simpler than a lot of the graphs that you will have seen over the last couple of days. This graph represents a quality of life over a period of time. So on the vertical axis, you've got some sort of measurement of quality of life. It's a pretty hard thing to measure. I think we'll probably all agree with that. Over time. And if you're in perfect health, it's a nice horizontal line near the top of the graph. Okay? However, what happens when you get sick, when you get ill, or when you have an injury? Your quality of life decreases. Okay? And if you're lucky, it won't decrease that much, and you will continue at a sustainable level. Okay? And the difference between the top and the bottom of those graphs is what we call the burden of illness. And I'm showing this in a relatively sort of mechanical way, because this is the way that HTAs look at the problem. Okay? So the burden of illness is the difference between the quality of life before and after our illness. Okay? Now, once we've been diagnosed, or once we've taken on our illness, if you like, then we start treating it. And if the treatment works, our quality of life should improve. Okay? So the value, the benefit of the therapy that we're receiving is the difference between the quality of life we had before we had the treatment and our quality of life afterwards. Okay? So that's fundamentally what HTAs are trying to measure. They're trying to measure how good, how valuable is this therapy that we're being asked to assess. Okay? There's two questions that determine the size of that difference between the two lines. Two questions. The first question is, how good is this drug? How high can we get that graph once you start taking this drug? How many of the symptoms are effective? How much is survival improved, etc.? So how good is the drug? And at the same time, another question which equally affects the size of that difference is, how bad is the illness? Okay? So the larger the benefit of the drug is the difference between those two things. So who are the experts in answering those questions? Now, I would say that the experts in figuring out how good the drug is are probably the developers of the drug, the researchers who came up with the idea for the molecule, the way it was, and the proof that they've gathered about its effectiveness, and the physicians who've been working with them in that investigation, and the people who have been giving it to patients during the trial process. Patients are involved in that assessment of the benefit of the drug, but I think the primary leaders of answering that question are the developers, the manufacturers, and the clinicians. However, the experts in telling HTAs how bad the illness is us. We're the ones who live with the illness on a day-to-day basis. We're the ones who suffer the symptoms. We're the ones who have the concerns about survival, etc., etc. We are the experts in answering that question. And that question is equally important in determining the value of the therapy that's being assessed. So we are there to present evidence that our lives are materially, in so many different ways, affected by the condition that we have been unfortunate enough to have bestowed upon her, I don't know quite what the right word there is, that we're suffering from, we are the experts, okay? Now, what sort of evidence works in that setting? Now, traditionally, HTAs that have involved the patient voice have organized, well, there's nearly always a document that you're supposed to produce that sort of summarizes the patient kind of viewpoint. But a very common process is that a meeting is held and a patient expert or a patient representative appears at the meeting. And it's extremely effective for a real person to appear in one of these rooms, especially a patient that looks really ill and somebody who is clearly suffering the effects of an illness. Okay? And it can be an extremely powerful and emotive impact that testimony can have in that setting. But HTAs are very, very data and evidence-driven processes. So however impactful, and I'm not by any means devaluing the impact of a patient story, but what has even more impact to HTA processes is data. And this is one of the points that was made earlier this morning. And data is data about the burden of illness. So the more systematic evidence, the more numerical evidence we can gather as patient groups to prove the burden of illness, to show how bad the illness is, the better the outcome is likely to be in the HTA process. Evidence needs to be relevant. It needs to be about the condition that is being discussed, and you need to show that it's relevant. It needs to be rigorous. It needs to be gathered in a systematic way, and it needs to be demonstrably true and up to date. Okay? And it needs to be significant. It needs to show something powerful to the people looking at that data. That's what I think is the challenge for patient groups in this context. So, in conclusion to that hopefully quite simple message, I would suggest that there are a small number of things that I think we can all do. Firstly, find out how HTAs work in your country. Now, about 5 years ago, I didn't even know what HTA stood for. I certainly didn't know how it worked in the UK, and I didn't find out by myself. I happen to know a couple of people in leukemia care, and they are very, very knowledgeable in this area, and I'm very much indebted to our colleagues in leukemia care for the help that they've given with doing that. And I'm looking at Beth when I say that because I've been working with her on a specific proposal that will be made to the UK HTA authority called NICE, funny name, in the next couple of weeks. And she's been extremely helpful in that process, in fact, instrumental in that process. So don't feel like you have to go and do that by yourselves. Reach out in your countries for other patient groups, probably larger, more established ones who will be more familiar with those processes in your country. Make contacts with other patient organizations, kind of the point I was making just then. Assemble your evidence. Now, this could be the difficult and the time-consuming part. So surveys of the burden of illness are probably the most important kind of method for doing this. But they take time, they take effort, and they take some skills and some experience to do that. That's one of the things that I hope that our network will begin to, where it will begin to be a benefit to you guys, is in helping develop those tools and showing you examples of how that can be done. And lastly, when you do it, share your experience, share your knowledge, share the tools that you used, share the surveys that you did. The more we can do this, the more we build up a kind of a global body of evidence that increasingly we'll be able to use in different contexts all around the world. So that was hopefully my kind of simple message about gathering evidence this morning. So I'd like to hand over to Michelle from myMPN Research Foundation, who has a complementary perspective on what we're talking about this morning. Thanks.
Thank you. As Jon mentioned, my name is Michelle Woerhle. I'm from the United States, and I represent the myMPN Research Foundation. And as he said, it is very complementary to what he discussed and what we've heard over the past several days about evidence gathering. And this is really what I consider to be a case study of what we've heard. This is an ongoing data collection project called myMPN that we initiated last year. And it was initiated to bolster the research that has been ongoing in our field for years, but which we were hoping to contribute more of the patient voice to, particularly around areas that they wanted to see developed in terms of therapies. This is a project that we took on from funding that we had raised from patients and patient family members initially, and the bulk of the project is supported directly by those contributions, but we have accepted some industry contributions as well. A note on that, we have a steering committee that oversees this project that reviews any access to the data that might come through, oversees any sort of consent forms and changes to the protocol and the surveys. So this is very much a project that is independent of external voices outside of the patient community and academic researchers who are guiding the project. At this point, we have 700 people in the United States who have been enrolled, whose data we've presented at EHA and possibly maybe at ASH, we'll see, in some posters. This is really a natural history study. So this is not a static survey, but this is it's a survey that is like a jumping off point. So we're going to assess people at one point in time and then continue to have them come and fill additional surveys in so that they can report back to us and in turn the research community how they are doing, what medications they have changed, and has their disease converted. And luckily, speaking of sharing resources, we didn't have to start this from scratch. We used the work of Ruben Mesa as a jumping off point, using his symptom assessment form. And also the steering committee contribute to any sort of additional survey, such as a nutrition survey, which will be coming online soon. Let's see. So this was created to really drive research and maybe create hypotheses that can be followed up on further outside of the surveys. But another reason this is very useful is that it contributes to our discussions with the FDA. So in the United States, the FDA is the group that oversees whether or not a medication is approved or not for use for patients. And I have been part of many discussions with not many, but a few discussions over the years with myMPN patients and the FDA, where they have shared their frustrations, they've shared their hopes with various representatives, and they came with their personal anecdotes and their personal information. And even if that's bolstered by their experience as advocates or knowledge of many patients, without the kind of rigorous and significant data, they have empathy, but it's not going to impact their decision making. So what we have been doing over the years is trying to learn how to speak their language. And regulatory environments, I think, are dynamic. They can change. They can change the committees or the ways you can interact with them. So we are still learning about this all the time. And Jon said he's not an expert on the HTAs in England. I don't profess to be one in the United States as well. We would need a bigger staff. But it's something that is incredibly important. It's one of the most vital things that we can do, and we're trying to work and hopefully learn from experience of others. But there is an opportunity at the FDA to have what they call a patient-focused drug development meeting. And you can apply for this, and it can be an external meeting. So you get to drive the agenda, you get to say what your goals are, and then the end document, you hope, is sort of like a white paper which says, this is what the patients want in terms of drug development or therapeutic development. So I keep referring to this as a very aspirational presentation, because the bottom line is, we did apply for this meeting actually just before I came here, but we don't know yet if we're even going to get it, and we don't know what the results of that meeting will be in the end. But we won't stop trying, so we're going to try to figure this out one way or the other. And now again, so what does this do to help patients? So we're gathering this information and we're getting it down on a piece of paper. We're presenting it to regulatory authorities, to industry, to other patient groups. I think what this does is it takes all of the things that we hear as advocates from people, their frustrations and their concerns, and it puts them in a language, again, that can be understood by these regulators who are used to clinical data. They're used to objective data. And, you'll hear a lot about subjective versus objective data. And, we're really trying to bridge the gap so that they understand. Now, again, this doesn't mean that there's going to be a drug to answer this, but we want to at least have put that foot out there to say, this is what the reality of the patient experience is, and these are what they want. This is what they want to have happen from therapies. So we know that this is a possibility because another group, Muscular Dystrophy Duchenne, created a similar white paper. And, again, this remains to be seen. But my time's up, so I'm going to pause. 2 minutes? Oh, okay. So again, you're talking about anecdotes, talking about, subjective data versus objective data. Our goals for myMPN are to validate the information by tying it to clinical data, such as the results of CBCs, such as the result from the clinic of the genetic mutations, including changes that may happen. And that's information that patients may know, but they may not know comprehensively. So that's an ongoing process. So the platform that we use to build the registry is run by Genetic Alliance, which is a nonprofit in the United States. They're a global nonprofit. And I share this with you because they want other people to use the platform. And it did cost something to get it started and to keep it going. But, the point is to leverage all of our voices and all of our strengths to make this really good. And some enhancements that we're hoping for the platform include translation, mobile accessibility, which will help for especially people who don't have a PC at their home, and also the connection of the electronic health data, which is a very complicated issue, but that is absolutely the goal because that would give you a really robust look at what patients are going through. And let me see. Well, so I already mentioned this, that we've invested our own funds in this project, and we're going to see where it goes. But I'll end on that note. See if there's any questions.
Thank you. There are some questions.